A very good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Kaizen Central from Manufacturing TV. I hope you're all enjoying the summer, what little there has been of it so far. I'm told a heat wave is coming down the track, but right now, outside my window, a summer storm is raging. So I have to say, better inside with all you wonderful people from Kaizen Central. And I'd like to welcome Jeremy Bowley, who's going to talk to us today about an issue we touched on 6 months ago, but it's an extremely agile and moving picture because it's about supply chains, it's about procurement, and it's about the optimization of procurement at a time when people are talking about reshoring, people are talking about trying to save money. Inflation is beginning to bite. In some areas, we're told 4% at a national level, but some components and raw materials are going much higher than that. It's a very febrile time in the procurement industry. Jeremy is an expert inside a pro. It's all they do is really help medium and large companies manage their procurement. And I'm really grateful to him for talking to us tonight about it. To give a little bit of detail and some background, my good chum Johnny Williamson at the manufacturer, when he knew we were going to be talking about this, shared this graphic with us. I just want to use it and maybe hand over to Jeremy now, if he can just comment on this, because I'm wondering what that tells you about manufacturers and their appetite for bringing production closer to home, Jeremy, because clearly that is one of the things at the level of the UK manufacturing sector that we're all hoping is going to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thanks for the opportunity to talk again today. Absolutely, I mean, it's a great graphic, and it really sort of highlights the fact that this is a issue for people right now. We've had a lot of disruption. I think we all know that. That naturally leads to people's more intention to move stuff closer to home. And I think what's really interesting is that people have already moved, and we'll come on in a second, I'll talk about it a little bit more. But that started several years ago. That process of looking back at supply chains and reshoring them is not a brand new thing. Organizations have already started to move, in some cases in reasonable numbers, and we're starting to see that process really accelerate for a whole range of reasons. I think naturally we all prefer a supply chain that is less complicated, less scary, less worrying, shorter, easier. It's very, very easy. Even in normal times, it's much easier to go to, Rotherham to go and talk to your suppliers than it is to go to China to talk to your suppliers. And sometimes you need to do stuff face to face. So even at a very, very practical level, I think we all appreciate that it's a lot easier if it's locally. So I'm absolutely not surprised to see this sort of graphic. It absolutely fits with my experience. But I think the bit I wanted to talk about tonight really was we have tripped over a new barrier here. There is a new, I think the pandemic, what's happened recently has really changed things. So if you don't mind, I'll bring up a couple of slides, Nick, that I put together for today's discussion.
Yeah, go for it, Jeremy, please.
Yeah, I'm operating technology at the speed I'm capable of it. So apologies if that's a touch slow. This is how I sort of set it up, really. The open secret about Far East supply chain that nobody wants you to know. And it is an open secret, as you've seen, because plenty of people know about it. And the question is, are you going to do something about it? And what does it mean for your organization, for your business? So this is kind of where we were. And I think this is the stuff I've heard time and time again. I've worked with, probably certainly more than 100 organizations in my career. And back, let's say 2019, like China is cheap. We can't compete. We know we can't compete. So we're going to do one or two things. Either we're going to not bother competing with Chinese organizations selling to the UK. So we're not going to pursue that business. We're going to look elsewhere. Or we're going to take parts of our production, componentry, sub-assemblies, and sometimes finished products, and we're going to buy them ourselves from China. Why? Because it's cheap. And I think that kind of, sort of very much rang true. We talked briefly about university research earlier before the session, and the sort of 2017 stuff from Warwick University really rammed that home. So, not a new report, 260 odd people manufacturing leaders involved in this piece of research. Pretty decent quality piece of research too, and the message is absolutely clear. It was about cost. Now, if you look, there's a bit of a tail that talks about some other good stuff, and there's some warm words around it. But let's be blunt, right? You go to China because it's cheap, and that has just been the pervading view for a very, very long time. Frustrating as it has been for us in UK manufacturing. But and why was that true? Well, there's three things that really matter when you're sourcing, and certainly when you talk about today: availability, agility, and what that means in terms of sort of investment and ability to continue to grow the business. So, back in 2019, pretty consistent. China, Far East, same. Whether we use those interchangeably. So certainly true of Vietnam and places like that, India too, as well. You could get things consistently. The landed prices were pretty stable. We weren't seeing big bounces around in container prices, and shipping was pretty straightforward. You could easily ask those suppliers to scale up or contract down in terms of scale and volume. That was pretty straightforward. They were pretty compliant, pretty hungry really for your business. And that was great because you could get what you wanted from them. They put the hard yards in on new product cycle time. So if you wanted to bring a new product to market, they would take the time to help you build up tooling. They would help you with the design process. They'd help you with all those sorts of things. They're very, very accommodating. And from an investment perspective, and I deal quite a bit with investors and funders. If you were sourcing from China, there was a kind of implied, well, it must actually be quite good value then. So we don't need to look at the buy side of the margin equation because it must be good value because it's from China. We all know that China's cheap because of all the reasons that we've just talked about. And what was interesting is there's very little scrutiny pre-2019 on that from most people involved in the process. So the logic would follow. Even if you bang the drum about, it's possible to do this better in Europe or in the UK, people would come back and say, well, it's China, it must be, so we won't even bother looking. So an awful lot of organizations just did very, very little with it. Their investors didn't push them. And I won't go as far to say people didn't care. It's the perceived wisdom very much was that graphic that we saw from Warwick University. So it was very cost-driven and it was just taken as read. And I think what's fascinating really is that's changed now, and I think this stuff. So none of what I'm going to say now is going to be a surprise. What's I think more interesting, and Nick, I think we should try and sort of maybe build into some of the debate is the so what and what's really happening. So I am right now in working with customers who are sourcing from China, have sourced from China and places like that, and this is the reality on the ground. Production's very, very choppy. You may well be aware of this. There have been a series of local lockdowns in China, some you know about, some you don't know about. Getting stuff out, getting workers into factories and out of factories, getting production right is difficult. It is not consistent. It is not much fun to be involved in at the moment. I'm sure all of you will know that the price of a container has probably gone up tenfold. We had a customer talking about paying $20,000 for a container when they were paying $1,800 a container a couple of years ago. That changes the equation on an awful lot of products. Those sorts of costs, they've certainly increased. Different people are paying different amounts. I had a customer the other day who couldn't even get anyone to even talk to him about any containers until after Christmas, and that's now in the summer. That's pretty scary for quite a number of businesses. And of course, if all that's going on, if you think about agility, it's incredibly difficult to match supply and demand. We are facing into this new world, and none of us, certainly I don't, know what that really means in terms of forecasting production volumes. So that process of matching off supply and demand, laying down production at the right time, making sure I'm not chewing up loads of working capital, and making sure that that process is running sensibly, is really hard. Most of my customers can't forecast with lots of confidence 12, 18 months out. And we need to, because the supply chain is now so brittle, particularly if it's out of the Far East. There's a real pressure, I think, on new product development timelines and timescales. Some products and services now, the rate of change is being accelerated by all the stuff we've seen. Brexit, changing habits and changing attitudes, the way we sell to customers. People want subtly different products faster and faster. That rate of new product introduction is increasing and increasing. Really, really hard if you're dealing with a country that you can't visit. Really, really hard if you're reliant on their technical expertise and their capability to get you up and running, because I think if any of you have bought stuff from a foreign country, there's a language barrier, there's a culture barrier, and there's just the practical barrier of dealing with those organizations. Incredibly difficult to do. Possible to do over Zoom, real hard, as you know. And I think this is the last bit as well, which has become something that matters now. In my job day to day, I talk to investors. 2019, a few people talked about the importance of ESG and the importance of where you get your stuff from, how good your supply chain is, how clean your supply chain is. Absolutely, now that matters a lot. There are funds out there that will only invest if you've got good ESG credentials. You will get a lower cost of capital if you have a positive ESG story. You'll have more lenders, more people that you can go to, more private equity firms will be prepared to invest. And if you can couple that with consistency, then you become a very, very investable prospect. Pick up the press, look at the major retailers and the major organizations that have got themselves into hot water on this sort of investability ESG side, and you'll see that that's becoming increasingly prominent overall. So let me just pause there for a second and just Nick, I think we should maybe throw that open. I mean, that's certainly what I'm seeing. I'd just be curious to see if you're seeing a sort of similar picture, whether you're buying or selling.
Okay, let's find out what's the buzz on the street, because I know at one point that Jeremy makes very, very well there and very clearly is that this is not suddenly something that's happened just because of Brexit and COVID. I know that they will be a spike in terms of the timeline, but I remember doing stories with the US reshoring initiative several years ago, and they actually published a calculator which demonstrated quite clearly that if manufacturers really factored in all the costs involved, including increasing labor prices in China, the competitive advantage that Asia, we keep saying China, but I mean Asia more generally, was actually eroding before Brexit and COVID hit. But now with the supply chain fragility thrown into the mix, there's clearly something going on there. I was actually surprised by that graphic that Johnny Williamson showed earlier. I'm going to share it again because I know some of you have. Do you mind if I just take the screen back a second, Jeremy?
Yeah, go for it. Yep.
Because some of you have not been, were not here at the very beginning. I don't know whether I should. I'd like to find out if people are surprised by some of that. Some of the information in that slide. I thought there'd be more inclination to move to locally made. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm overestimating the ability of the sector to respond quickly to events. And heaven knows, all businesses have their own inertia. What does anybody else think? Somebody like Richard Jones. I mean, you're very good at this sort of thing. You understand a lot about it. Does this surprise you?
I'm similarly slightly surprised it's not more than that, because the word on the street, and I don't know how far this chart is lagging, but the word on the street is that nearly every company that I talk to is looking to move at least some product back, and it's becoming fashionable, which is great. And the whatever your political hue, I think manufacturing is much more front and centre because of the move up north, etc., and the move to the northeast of all the various investments. And I think people are actually talking about manufacturing, and they've realised, particularly through COVID, through the debacle over PPE, that if we don't have, okay, we can make fighter aircraft and we can make submarines and we can make aircraft carriers, but if we can't make masks competitively, it's silly. And I'm not saying that we're going to make them cheaper, but at least we've got the agility to respond. So I can see this accelerating. That's my view.
Thank you. Anybody else got any thoughts on that, or any? I'm going to stop sharing right now, or any anecdotal evidence as Richard has been describing, because I wonder, Jeremy, what you think the conclusion or what's the message we should be taking from this, that people are leaving too much cash on the table, or what?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to respond to Richard's comments a moment ago, there's two things I'd raise. So the first thing is, there's a big assumption that if we're bringing stuff back from, let's say, China or the Far East, that the destination has to be the UK. And the reality is it doesn't. We can bring part of that supply chain back. So what's interesting is that, and I'll show it in a second, I'll put some more slides up, Nick, in a second, but we can assemble quite a bit of product here. We can't always get all the componentry right and at the right price and have enough capacity, frankly, to do everything, but we can do more than we're doing now. So there's a kind of, it doesn't have to be a slam dunk. The question is not getting it into the north of England, for example, but if you can get it to, so let's say assembly into the UK, but some of the components supply out of North Africa, that's far preferable. I know it's not UK, but that's far preferable than having an elongated supply chain where it's going to take you weeks on the water to get to the UK. If you can, it is much simpler to get it out of some of those sort of North African, maybe, Portugal's quite a good place to be. Turkey, by contrast, is absolutely not a good place to be. You talked about 4% inflation we have here in the UK. That's about the monthly factory gate inflation in Turkey. So, do pick your locations. But there's definitely low cost labor available, much closer to the UK. And I think the assumption is it has to be a slam dunk. It doesn't. It just has to be shorter and less complicated than it was before. And I think I don't know how well that is understood, frankly, by the people doing it. And I do think we suffer a bit of a skills shortage because, hey, look, if you look at people who've been at work for say 20 years, they don't necessarily have the skills to source this stuff locally because they haven't had to. Because the message has been, well, let's just take it out to China. And that's been the message since, I don't know, say in the mid-80s, probably, and maybe even before that. So I do think we have a bit of a skills gap and we need to reevaluate that because it's a different thing to start to take more control of the supply chain and to source it closely. Because in order to do that, you're going to have to split that up a bit more. You have to get a bit more involved. You can't just dump it on a Chinese manufacturer who does everything for cheap. I think you have to be a bit more astute as an organization to do that.
I think that's a really interesting observation you make, Jeremy, that actually there is nearly a generation of manufacturers, those who are likely to buy in components and so on, who actually don't know anything else but buying it in cheaply from offshore. So there is an education process. Mark, you've raised your hand. Mark Amphlett, I should say.
Thanks, Nick. I used to be guilty of purchasing from China myself, despite being an avid promoter of UK manufacturing. So the sort of issues that you haven't mentioned there, Jeremy, are the fact that when you push the price down even lower than you anticipate, the ethics seem to disappear quite along the same sort of level as the price does. I specifically spend a lot of time in Shenzhen sourcing tooling for injection molding, and I'd have to spend a lot of time going over there to check the actual quality of the tools that were made. Also to check the fact that they weren't lying to me. So for example, when they tell me the cycle time's 30 seconds, and in reality they can only manufacture 10 a day, you have to go there and actually check all this sort of stuff yourself. And when they do actually do a job half right for you, all of a sudden the price rises up. I mean, that's the famous phrase, is you probably heard, price rise up all the time. So those are issues that I personally face, which reiterate what you're going on about, Jeremy. But also, I noticed that you did talk about the sustainability side of things as well. And I know that Boohoo had an issue recently with their supply chain out in different countries about employing people of a certain age which shouldn't really be working. So those are just my experiences of it, and this is why I'm pushing as hard as I can to bring as much stuff back onto the shore, because we stick to our prices, we stick to the quality, and we stick to using the right sort of workforce.
I don't know, Nick, whether you're going to respond or whether I should. But I mean, I wholeheartedly agree, Mark. I mean, if the factory is a long way away in a different culture, a different time zone, then inevitably you can't be close to it, and you do see all sorts of bizarre things happening. You know, I've had stuff show up. I've bought plenty of stuff from China. I've had stuff show up, and it's just not what I expected. And quite often it'll be the things that bits of the process that kind of fall down that you don't necessarily understand, and it'll be things like, it was on the drawing, so that's what we made, and actually it wasn't quite what we wanted. And when you've got a 40-foot container showing up full of not quite the right stuff, and that can be quite an issue. It's much easier to solve that if you can go and check pre-production runs because you've got to drive 2 hours up the road, or even jump on a plane and go to the south of France, that you might be able to do that in a day. You know, that's a fundamentally different proposition from having to get out to deepest, darkest China and do it in that environment. I think the other thing I'd add is, quite often when we're sourcing from the Far East and people sourcing from the Far East, not exactly sure who we're buying it from, and sometimes not even quite sure who's making it. Repeatedly, what I've seen is the use of intermediaries. I don't know many people. I think I know 2 or 3 are very strong with the Chinese language and able to communicate effectively and do business off their own bat. But the vast majority of people rely on some sort of agent or some sort of intermediary. That is a very, very murky world. And I think that leads to that kind of interesting ethical question as to, well, where's the money really going? Well, who's really in control? And to what extent have I really got my arms around this? Which is pretty, if you're going to go out and ask for investment, you're going to be in the public eye and you're going to grow your business. That's quite a risk.
Yeah, just going to that, Jeremy, I've experienced in factories where I rock up to the reception one day and they've got their sign on the wall. When I go back the next day, there's a different sign, a different company name. So they're expecting different visitors. The sort of tricks they play sometimes. We, as a British culture, we find it hard to understand that ethically they can even think about doing this, let alone actually do it themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that there are plenty of very, very good and solid businesses out there, but you just got to do your research. You just got to be careful. And I'd definitely say, look, and we absolutely should still buy from China and from the Far East. It has a role to play, but I think the equation has changed, and we can start to bring more back. I always, when I talk to businesses about most subjects, I'm always encouraging people to think about next practice. What's the next step that we can take that gets us a little bit further along the journey, as opposed to worrying about leaping ahead? And I wonder with that graphic, Nick, whether you showed it when you showed earlier, whether that's because people perceive as reshoring as this enormously difficult and challenging exercise. We've got to bring everything back, and it's got to be to the UK, and it's got to be it's got to be everything, all the finished components and all the bits and all the bobs, and it's really complicated, and the engineering time and our drawings are not very good. And when did we last actually have a costed bomb? Well, actually, we haven't got one of those. And are you sure that that's the right thing? Is that the most up-to-date product, or have there been some changes? And all those sorts of things. It just looks like hell if you are facing into that. If you ask yourself a different question and you say, which bits of this production process, which bits of this product can we serve well out of the UK or Europe, or close to the Eurosphere, then I think you come to a different answer, and it's much more executable than thinking about this enormous, great, let's stop making it in China. Because, hey, who wants to take one of their main products out of the factory where they're making it, where it works, and expose the business to huge risk? I mean, it's a massive play. It's a huge strategic move to start doing that. So I encourage people to look for small opportunities to do it, lower volume products, different areas, things that maybe, are components of the process, maybe just the assembly. Maybe keep all the components in China and just bring the assembly back to the UK. You'd be amazed at how many very, very good businesses are able to do that. And then you can use that as a base to build that up.
I wonder how much of offshoring initiative was down to the fact, as last week's guest, Tom Brown, was talking about, one of the criticisms he made over the last 4 or 5 decades of UK manufacturing is there were too many accountants on the board and too few engineers, and whether the just the pure bottom line attraction of offshoring meant that people running companies with an accountancy background said, well, we've just got to do it, and didn't take into account all the other bits and pieces that could quite possibly add friction to the whole process. But as far as they were concerned, there was a good deal when it came to calculation on a piece of paper.
Can I furiously disagree, Nick, with that?
Oh, I'd be delighted if you did, but I'm quite ashamed.
So I will, and I'll tell you why. So firstly, I'm not an accountant at all. I don't have any numeric qualifications beyond sort of the basic maths, really. But let me say this: I'm involved regularly on make v buy decisions, reshoring, not reshoring, those sorts of things. And I tell you what I see. I see absolute consistency in the failure to account for internal cost correctly, whether that's in offshoring, make it in-house, push it out of house. The accountancy is extraordinarily weak. So I don't think the answer is less accountants, more engineers. That doesn't feel right to me. I think what the exercise really is a proper understanding of what our costs are and a proper attribution of them. Because on a regular basis, I've seen customers with keeping factories going they should have closed years ago because they don't cost for it properly. I had a customer tell me not a short time ago that it didn't matter. The machine cost didn't really matter because it was fully depreciated, which is fine as long as that machine is going to last forever. That's no problem at all. The reality is those things don't last forever, and certainly don't in today's sort of fast changing world. So I don't think less financial literacy is definitely the answer. You can make a case for saying we need to have more to be a more product led company. I think I would agree on that. But no, you'll make some pretty shonky decisions if you can't get the math straight. I will definitely say that.
Okay, so maybe it's just maybe the number of accountants is an accurate observation by Tom Brown. It's just none of them are doing their job properly.
Maybe, Nick. Maybe.
I'll say that. You don't have to. I'll take the blame for that one.
No, that's fine. Nick, if I just grab the share back, I was just sharing another couple of things that I think are kind of useful for people and certainly may stimulate some discussion. So, I mean, you've all seen this kind of piece. This is very real. I mean, hopefully you've been to Sainsbury's or Morrison's or wherever it is you go to do your shopping, and then you've seen this on a regular basis. I have. I have a customer right now who's out of stock on almost all of their main lines. It's not great for the P&L. If you can't get the product out, no matter how cheap it is, and that's very real. So the real impact on this is huge, and I've heard this time and time again. Okay,
Steve Murphy, you had your hand up.
I was going to just back up what was effectively your conclusion, Nick, and that is that it's not that we don't need good accountancy. It's not that we don't need good financial analysis. It's the fact that a lot of it is quite thin. It's not particularly well done, and it needs to be done thoroughly. And I see the same when I'm driving continuous improvement activity. I give you an example. I once was responsible for a massive increase in the die yield in the pilot line. So you say, well, if you've doubled the pilot line, are we going to shut half the pilot line down? So on the whole, it was a good thing. But if you say, well, okay, what is the consequences of doubling the yield in the pilot line? You're now going to pull your qualifications in by so many months. You're now going to start delivering to customers so much earlier, blah, blah, blah. And nobody knows how to do those calculations to say, well, that's worth so many million beer vouchers. So I would just fundamentally agree with you, is that we do need good financial calculations, but they have to be thorough and accurate, and something that you can you polish the skills to do that, so that it helps you to make good business decisions. That's all I have to say.
Apologies. Mark Amphlett, sorry, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry to go on about this sort of stuff. I'm quite passionate about this. I mean, the one thing that Jeremy probably faces a lot is I kind of guess it's your job to advise your customers on the best opportunities they've got for production and manufacturing, keeping the supply chain flowing. I've experienced from my time out in China, the fact that they don't always deliver on time. I know it's a shock, but they may promise a world and sometimes deliver nothing. And that little moulded part that they were producing for me, worth 5 pence, if that didn't arrive on time, that can prevent sales of a set of something worth £500, £600, £700 to go. So I guess Jeremy has to spend a lot of time not just looking at price, but also the efficiencies of the manufacturers out there, along with their ethics, and also the quality as well. You know, in this country, with the MRP, ERP side of things that I'm looking after for plastics in particular, full traceability is something that's important. I think that Sarah would agree with this. We have the systems in this country to trace things through, whereas, and I've experienced this firsthand, the Chinese have promised me that they've used a specific brand, a specific grade of material. I've been there, I've taken a photograph of the bag, I've sent it back to my distributors in the UK, they say it doesn't exist. And so the parts not turning up, and when they turn up, they're not actually made of the right material or traceable. You know, Jeremy, you've got a huge mountain to climb to make sure that it's not just about the price. And I'm guessing, Jeremy, you face this all the time.
Yeah, I think here's the message that I would really try and ram home. It's never been about the price, really. Price is just a balancing decision, really. It's got to work on price for sure. But no, I think very few organizations, if they really ask themselves a question, do I really, really, really want to have an extended supply chain just for a few more points on margin, just for a little bit of squeeze on that? No. I mean, most of us, I think, would probably look forward to a less stressful existence. So, you know, why would you want to keep pushing it on price when actually you probably take some certainty? And I think we probably all do that in our own lives. I mean, just look at the insurance market. You know, we go out there and we buy insurance because we want some insurance. You know, we want some security to know that if something unfortunate happens, we're covered and we're prepared to pay for that. And the same is true in business. And I think the same is true in most organizations. It is wrong to think that it is all about price, and it is wrong to think that it has always been about price. It's just convenient because we understand it.
The question I've got is, I've been dealing with some large companies in the past who have different departments that have different budgets associated with them. So I'll have a department that's got a budget for the tooling, for example, but then a different department has got a budget for the production. And then there's someone else in there who is head of procurement within the business, who's just there to strip out all costs. Now, those three things don't match in with what head of production wants. He wants quality, he wants a fair price, but he also wants the parts turning up on time. So I'm guessing you have to balance several plates within an organisation to make sure that you understand that they get exactly what they think they want. So I'm guessing education must be a big part of what you do as well.
Yeah, hugely. And the reality is that sort of siloed approach is not very helpful in most decision making, because you'll end up with somebody wanting to produce something that makes sense for their department, but for the business actually is counterproductive. There's a book, I think it's Robert Koch's 80-20 principle. If you've read it, it's an old book. I thoroughly recommend reading it, and I would absolutely endorse it. There's an awful lot of things in an organization that take value away as well as fail to add value. And I think he talks about it as being a third. You know, a third of the organization destroys value, a third doesn't really add any, and the third creates massive value. And you create massive value when you get people aligned and on the same page. You don't do that when they're sitting in their little silos. And the most guilty people of this, and I will talk about my own kind here, are procurement people, because we've been asked to chase down price because, quite frankly, we've been looking for relevance as a profession, and we've struggled with that because it's about far more than that. And we're not well trained typically to bring all that together and act as that custodian of the process, which is exactly, Mark, what needs to happen. Because otherwise you're going to make terrible decisions. It's going to be great for production, but it's going to be awful for technical. It's going to be fantastic for procurement, but it's going to be dreadful for the guys who've got to get their product out the door. I mean, you know, has to be a balancing act.
So how should procurement be targeted then? Because as you said there, targeted on reducing costs, I think is kind of suicidal for many companies because of the supply chain side of things. You need the parts in, you need them to be right first time. There's so much more added to it, but some shallow-minded people We'll just say, your job, Jeremy, is to reduce our cost by 5%. If you do that, here's your £200,000 bonus for the year. I think it drives wrong cultures.
Yeah, of course it does. And it comes back to setting the strategic plan for the business. So this comes back to being a leadership question. So take it right back to what do we need to achieve in the next 90 days, in the next year, in the next 3 years? What are the real things that drive value for our business? And we often talk about enterprise value. And so what that means is taking right back, taking all the politics out of it and saying, what actually really, really matters? Because an awful lot of the guff that we spend our time talking about and doing and all those sorts of things in organizations day to day, it doesn't really matter. So when you start to strip that back, you create time and space to do that. But that is, that's board down. That's CEO, CFO, the operations director. That is that tight-knit group of people who have to take responsibility for that. Because if you leave it to the individual silos on their own, they will naturally pursue their own interests. And that's human behavior. It's not wrong. It's just natural human behavior. So that then responsibility has to come back to that leadership team. If you're not prepared to do that, then the organization will do weird and perhaps wonderful, but probably not so wonderful things. And they certainly won't help your company's valuation. They will certainly won't help your job as a CEO. So I think it comes back to that and being tough with that leadership team, which is not always easy to do.
Fascinating. Steve?
I just think the simple question there that they asked, that what is procurement's job? And I'd say one role that is their role that they don't necessarily pursue that well is risk. It's simply risk mitigation. So when they're out buying things, their role is to mitigate the risk. So why do you have a backup supplier? Because you need to mitigate the risk.
Yeah, a huge part of what procurement should be doing, but that's hard, Stephen. So we don't like to do
tough.
That.
I mean, sorry.
That's too hard for us. No. We're much better off just shouting at somebody about 5p on the price of packaging. That's easy. We can do that. We can't face the real strategic, and it's a true thing. So we talked about manufacturing. There's a whole generation of people who've never sourced stuff before. That's a nightmare. If you're head of procurement in an organization, you've got to start asking your team, none of whom have ever had to do that ever at any point, because the only procurement they've ever done is ask their chap in China, can we have it 5 pence cheaper?
Yeah.
You've got to say, well, actually, I've now got to go to a factory in Scunthorpe and evaluate as to whether this is a good choice or not and a good decision. And actually, it's not just that factory in Scunthorpe. It's another 5 factories all around the UK or in Europe, which have now got to work together, because that's the only way we can get to the sort of the right levels of margin that we'd get from China or close to it. And it'll be much more robust, but that's proper hard. You've got to get out the office. You've got to actually leave your desk.
But I think that's just right. Well, it's a senior strategic decision, and maybe you're going to have to employ the caliber of person within purchasing who can do that, and it's not just somebody who just picks up the phone and asks for 5p off, like you say. You'll have to put proper change management processes in place. There's a whole bunch of people are suddenly going to be asked to do their job properly. And if all of a sudden they find themselves out on the streets selling the big issue because they've been replaced, then why is that a serious problem? Because it's not a big problem to me, because I don't even buy the big issue, Okay, I'm being slightly facetious, but my point is that traditionally British manufacturing has employed lots and lots of not necessarily that bright people. They've been decent people, they've been nice people, but they weren't necessarily best in class. And now all aspects of the manufacturing has to be best in class. It has to not want to be a team, it has to want to be the first team. And that was a horrible shock to a lot of engineers. And now it's going to come to a horrible shock to a lot of other people that the manufacturing is a place that you have to attract your very best people to. Otherwise you will not have the intellectual firepower to go and do the jobs you have. And that's something I don't think manufacturing has really faced up to in an honest way. But that's just my opinion. But it's just I have to deal with what you might call, I have to deal with purchasing a lot. And I would say, I want you to talk to these people and I want this data provided us to routinely in an Excel spreadsheet so we can analyze it. Oh, it's difficult. It's difficult. And it was always the same. It was difficult. So I got the same answer that you're getting. So, you know, my point would be I want people within those purchasing departments who can understand that they're a purchaser for a semiconductor company or a steel manufacturer and understand the requirements of that business and be able to ask technical questions of the suppliers.
Steve, you're asking an awful lot. You're asking an awful lot of people who, you know, procurement's job is to create strategic alternatives if it's going to actually do its job. So it's got to have the, you know, if in the event that we can't operate this supply chain, what about this supply chain? Is this supply chain fast enough for our customers' needs, or can we beat the competition to the market because we can be faster or better in fulfillment or better on quality, or whatever is the thing you choose to compete on? There's a question that Bob, you asked in the chat as well here. It's like, do people have the capability to do it? The answer is no. The answer is people do not have the capability to do it. We face a serious issue. If we're going to get this off the ground, we face a serious issue in getting this done. And you can't just stick it on procurement to do it, because it can't do it on their own. You've got to find people who can work with them. And it is a very, very hard job. You certainly can't give it to a graduate out of school or at university or a school leaver or somebody with 5 years experience, because if you're going to really do that, you're going to have to evaluate the strategic context. And that's pretty difficult. It's going to be meaningful. And that's a pretty difficult job. You know, an awful lot of people struggle with that. And you need to bring more than one person to the party to execute it. It's tough, and we're not ready, and we need to invest more in building our teams. So I agree with Bob. Yeah, do we have supply development capability? Most companies, absolutely not. Should they? Yes, absolutely. But will they? Probably not.
Okay, Stephen Barr raised your hand.
I'm kind of curious, even if we did have the capability to make these kind of decisions, do we feel that there is the capacity and the skills and the specialisms in the UK actually to take up the slack? I wonder if any of the manufacturers on this call have a view from their experience. How practical is reshoring, even if you knew how to do it?
Good question. Good question.
From my experience, Stephen, we've certainly got the experience in this country and the desire to do it. We've got manufacturers which are looking to grow, desperate to bring reshoring home and manufacture on these shores. So yeah, we've definitely got the ability to do it, but it always gets tarnished with the Chinese can do it cheaper. And the price is such a devastating thing that drives it down. Now, one thing I was going to ask Jeremy was how he copes when he gets, a company says we need to look at our procurement side of things, drive the costs down. But the first thing Jeremy does is go in there and say, right, this part is a vital part. You've only got one tool, you need to invest another £150,000 in a backup tool. So instead of saving money, he goes straight in there and says you need to start spending money to keep the continuity of that supply chain. Must be very difficult.
Yeah, I've done it this week though. And said, what matters to you? What creates value in your business? So if you're talking about businesses that have got, sensible access to cash, then it's not a difficult conversation because strategic context is compelling. It's do you want to take all the risk out of, do you take a chunk of risk out of your business, which affects the business valuation, your ability to lend, ability to borrow money, ability to get investment, and if you want to sell all or part of your business, does that really help? Yes, absolutely. It's a very short and very easy conversation with the right people. If you go and ask the finance controller for another couple of £100,000 to invest in a tool you're not going to use, then the answer is usually 2 letters and pretty quick. So again, it comes back to talking to the right people, talking to people about it in the right way. I think here's the other bit as well. We can be terribly lazy in this country as well in our own approach to pricing business. And I have to say, we let ourselves down. So we give the Chinese a good bashing. We deserve a bashing too, because at times I've seen us more than able to compete and have decided not to compete through greed or through lack of effort. So I've seen people want margins that are unsustainable. I've seen people not just get their act together and miss out on a fantastic opportunity for not just their own business but for the local economy, and that frustrates me intensely. So we need to recognise that we have to have leadership in our own sector. and we have to put the hard yards in. And if we're going to really make a difference, it's not going to be easy. Like, you never thought it would be, did you?
Is there any mechanism or any institution or any training available, Jeremy, that you know? Because I suspect that, as has been suggested by one or two tonight, that actually the procurement as an art, and I suspect it's an art and science and lots of things wrapped up together, doesn't get much attention. But I'm just wondering whether if we were to be better at it in this country, is there a mechanism by which people can get that kind of training?
So the answer to that is a bit of a mixed one. So do we have, for example, a really good, let's say if we worked in architecture where we've got RIBA, we've got a really good professional institution who are really very good and really very helpful. Our in procurement, SIPS is not very helpful. It's largely irrelevant. It's out of date. It is slow. It's interested in making money for itself. I'll be pretty irreverent about my view on that. And most people see it as irrelevant. I even worked with one procurement director who said the first thing I do is throw anybody with the qualifications CV in the bin, because they'll be indoctrinated in the old way of doing things. So I have heard that before. I think we're really struggling. I think it's more about thinking, not so much about training. I think it's more about finding and engaging with the leadership, because the procurement side of things isn't particularly difficult from a technical perspective. It is the ability to coordinate and understand the needs of multiple organizations, your own organization and the suppliers. And you're looking for good fits. You're looking for people that you would go out and you can see that you're on the same growth trajectory, that the same things matter to you that matter to them. And then it's a question of, there being a meeting of minds over, are we going to try and transact this in a civil and a sensible way? Because most people buy into the idea that you pay a fair price and get a fair product or fair service out of it. So I agree with the comment that just popped up there. It's not that hard. No, it's not. But it requires focus, it requires effort, and it requires a broad understanding of business. And that's not somebody with 3 years experience out of school. And sadly, that's what we do. So even if you gave them training, I think you give them some of the content, but I think they would lack the context to really add value. So I think it needs to come back up the tree. It needs to be CEO, CFO. They are strategic decisions. They are not tactical. We can't rely on junior people to do that. It's not fair.
Roy Spencer, you had your hand up a short while ago. I wonder if you still have a question to ask.
Well, it's more a comment, actually. I was thinking about the conversation we were having last week, and we were referring to, or it might even be the week before, we were referring to Germany and the amount of training that they put into people in their organizations. And I was just thinking back to my time there, and this qualification of Diplom Kaufmann, which has some status. And so people are taught differently, and they're taught and they're built up through the organization. The other thing we've talked about silos this evening. I think silos are just the thing which stops innovation, stops change in organization. And if you can organize your people around their supply chains. I mean, some years ago, I did a project in a pharmaceutical company that had, 10 different product lines. So, and it was just stagnating. And so I said, well, let's organize around these actual production lines that you've got and allocate your resources in that way. And so for me, you do need to start with the organization, and that's driven from the top, Jeremy, as you've already said. The culture of the organization is really set by the leaders, the example that they set and the behaviors that they reward. And and if you've got a silo organization, that's even more difficult. So that's, for me, that's what I do when I go into organizations. I look at some of those silos and say, well, can I break that down? And the third point I wanted to make was, you sometimes have to invest in your suppliers. It's not just about looking at your suppliers, but actually saying, well, look, there's an opportunity here. And if you're big enough, you can invest in your suppliers. And in the past, I've seen that be the case. And I'm not sure, I know we're in difficult times, but what's stopping that happening, if you really want to reshore stuff? And it's going to get worse because we're still not paying for the carbon in China, and prices are going to rise. There's no question about that. And so you've got to start now. we've all got to start now and address that issue, because it's going to come and hit us eventually. You're saying China's not really cheaper anymore, but it's going to get a lot more expensive because we're still not paying for the carbon.
Fair point, Steve.
Sorry, I've left my hand up by mistake, Nick. I'll bring it down. Sorry.
In that case, I'm going to put Alec on the spot. Alec, you've worked with China for a long time. And what Jeremy's been saying is, how much of that has resonated with you?
Bits and bobs. We haven't. Well, we could make machines in the UK for the same price we make them in China. We could make the quality a lot better. There's other issues in making things here. I think just in the broader context, my experience in corporate world, where the accountants are indoctrinated in cost reduction, and that comes into the productivity argument here as well. We see productivity as a cost reduction exercise rather than as a value creation. And I think we need to focus that whole mindset. I think the cultural point that Roy made was very good, and that the culture does come from the top down. So if we're setting up an organisation just to cut costs, and again in that corporate world I worked, accountancy would come, they would do 2 years, try to cut costs, make the profits look good and move on to another job. So it's this whole short-termism that we have in the UK. How can we fudge the figures and move on, leave somebody else to pick up the problem? In that particular company, we were always compared to the German subsidiary, which was the most profitable, best run, spent the most money on R&D and the most money on actually looking after the plant. But nobody was able to connect those dots here. And that always struck me as somewhat strange. The China thing is interesting because it costs me more to buy a flat in Chuzhou than it does to buy a flat in Solihull. So labour rates are rising, the costs are rising. There's lots of issues, obviously, with the COVID and this long supply chain that we have. I don't see any issues in reshoring here. I'd love to do it, but it's, we're struggling to keep the manufacture here rather than bring it back. So that's our challenge.
Interesting. Yeah, that I mean, what Jeremy was saying right from the get-go in this conversation was that, the Brexit, COVID, call it what you will, there's the sort of twin things that have hit us. But all this has been going on for some time as labour costs, property costs, their costs have risen, and their competitive advantage is going. And given what Mark Amphlett was saying about the way that some of the uncertainty around dealing with them, you can't keep a competitive advantage if people can't trust who they're dealing with. So that much is very apparent. We've got another 6 or 7 minutes to go. Who'd like to jump in? Or Jeremy, maybe by all means take the floor back if
I got a couple of
saying resonates.
Couple of things I thought I'd share if you want me to do that, or if somebody else wants to speak, I'm happy. I mean, this is how I'm really slow, Nick, on getting this technology up and running. So this way I just talk amongst yourselves. This is a really good point, I think, which is, we know some people have moved right now. I like this quote from Kai Han, which is, what's the next battleground? I think it is shorter and more robust supply chains, no question. And I think it's speed of innovation and how fast you can get products to market. I don't think that is best served by China. And I think you're right, China gets more expensive. But it's not just getting on with it quick, it's about understanding how to use that. And we've talked about that today. And our challenge is that there are not that many people that get it at the moment. So I think we're in early adopters phase. The good news is if you're on the left-hand side of this graph, you make a disproportionate amount of additional profit and market share. If you're on the right-hand side of this graph, i.e. you do this late, you will be competing for capacity with everybody else. We are already seeing that now. So act now is definitely, whether you're buying, whether you're selling. So, I talk about buying a lot. I also talk to people about selling. And it's amazing how much money we're leaving on the table in lost sales to companies who would love to buy stuff from the UK, who'd love to buy the stuff that we make, but we don't even get in the conversation, we don't even get in the market. So it's both sides of the equation. It's buying and selling where we're missing out. This is quite useful. What's being reshored? Loads of finished goods was pre-pandemic was the picture. Less so sub-assemblies, components, remanufacturing. I still think that's probably true now. That's certainly what I'm seeing, more finished goods. But that said, a number of my clients are looking at sub-assemblies. Some componentry is inevitably going to stay out in the Far East for now because you just can't set up. I don't know. We talked about chip Mageddon, I'm sure, before, right? We know that that's not going to get, you can't the barriers to entry are too big. to get all the stuff back. But it's going to be parts. So finished goods and sub-assemblies are the two obvious places where to start. And that's already started. And I've seen a ton of that stuff. And, this is the thing on the sales. Customers will pay a premium for consistency and that availability. We know we can get a similar price from China. You won't save money. You may give away a few points of margin, but it's worth it. I would strongly advise you on that. It's much more agile and simpler. We talked about that already. And customers are starting to care. And the reason that customers are starting to care is because their investors are starting to care. And you know what? We talked about it already. Money talks. And if the guy who's writing the checks is saying, show me where you got that stuff, because actually I need to report back to the guys I got this money from and tell them that it's come from a good place. And actually we're not investing in child labor or sort of, problematic stuff. And that's really going to matter. So that's going to accelerate. So 4 things to do, really simple things as well. And you can do it on a piece of paper. You don't need a spreadsheet. You don't need loads of work. You don't need loads of effort. Start writing down where you think you get your stuff from. Start thinking about what the options were, even if that's in a very simple way. Think about how well you control the product, the process of specifying, so new product development process and writing that spec. Awful lot of organizations fall over that point 3. They think, oh, well, we'll just do it. And let's just get the drawings, and you get them out on the bombs and they're just not accurate, or they're not up to date, or in some instances, they don't even have them, or they've even lost the design rights to use it, and they've struggled with it with the intellectual property issue. And then once you've done that stuff and you can see the way forward and you're starting to execute on it, sell it. Like, customers want to buy it. I've never, ever struggled to convince somebody that buying something from somewhere closer to home is a good idea. Everybody knows it is. But you know what? We don't tell people. So I get on with doing that. I want to hear more of that stuff, certainly in my buying capacity, but also when I'm talking to companies about what they're selling and how they're selling stuff out, because very few people do that anywhere near as well. I'm sure a number of you have been to the States. Those guys are past masters at it, and it means a cash premium whether you're buying, whether you're selling. So I totally go out there and celebrate it. It's worth it.
Yeah, something resonated with me there when you were talking about the selling side of it, and I expect Mark Amphlett was nodding furiously when you were talking about we're not making the sales point because we're not marketing ourselves properly. We're not getting out there and telling people what our capacity is and what our capabilities are. We're assuming we only deal with the people we've always dealt with. We're not thinking about expanding our optimal marketplace. Steve, you've got a point. We've got 3 minutes to go.
Just a quick point to back up what Jeremy's saying. I've often been involved in putting fairly major plans together for improving customer satisfaction. 10s and 20s of quite major actions. And the point is, I've found that you don't have to complete and be perfect on all your 10 to 20 actions. Even if you make a good job of 3 or 4 major ones, a so-so job of a few that were pretty low, and a sound job of the middle, the customers go from totally being pissed off with you to being happy as Larry. They go from moaning at the CEO to being nice to the CEO. So even making a half decent job of dealing with your customers' concerns usually gives you an opportunity to sell more product. So my point is, it's a bit like what Jeremy was saying. You don't have to be that great at it. You don't have to employ 27 black belts or anything. Just do a simple sort of what are your customers' concerns? What are the biggest concerns with your biggest customer? And make a proper effort about fixing them. And they'll go, and you'll probably get yourself a stack more business, 5% more of their business without even trying. And your engineers will be happier, and so will your people, because they're doing useful work. It's low-hanging fruit everywhere.
There's a recipe for you. Time has marched on. Time to say goodbye. But Jeremy, dare I say that was a brilliant exposition of a little studied area of the process, and I found it really enlightening. I want to thank you very much indeed for coming on at short notice to talk to us about it. So much food for thought. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I hope you enjoyed it yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Pleasure.
Okay, well, listen, everybody. Thank you for being with us as always. Our grateful thanks to you, Jeremy. Excellent, excellent talk. Really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for your impassioned and thoughtful contributions. As always, a great conversation. I'll say goodbye now. That's Kaizen Central.